la conferencia de clausura. Hemos preferido, teniendo en cuenta los días, todos han dicho que es viernes por la tarde, que todo el mundo está un poco cansado, pero realmente hemos sido testigos privilegiados del tiempo que el embajador Sánchez-Benedito y de su conocimiento profundo del país. Ha sido embajador en Etiopía durante 4 años, embajador también ante la Unión Africana, y bueno, pues seguro que vamos a aprender los no etíopes mucho de la presentación que va a hacer ahora el embajador Sánchez-Benedito. Antonio.
Gracias, Luis. Well, I think that my esteemed colleague, Ainhoa, has set a precedent speaking in English, so I think I will also try and do my best, make an effort, as a reference also to my Ethiopian brothers and sisters. I'm very happy to welcome you here in Salamanca, finally in Spain. I'm also very glad to participate once more in this symposium organized by Professor Kinerabati. Thanks to your dynamism, to your enthusiasm, and your commitment to Africa, especially to Ethiopia. I ask you also to be indulgent, because certainly Ainhoa has set the bar very high, and because of her impeccable English. When she asked for support on a couple of occasions, I'm sure she did it out of modesty, not to, in order to facilitate also our task. Let me say first that the presence here of our Ethiopian colleagues has given a focus to Ethiopia in this particular symposium, together with the fact that I had the honor to serve in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, for a few years. I think I was obliged to dedicate my presentation to Ethiopia and to Africa. And I think Ethiopia can be considered as a paradigm in many aspects of tendencies and trends in the whole of the continent. In many things, Ethiopia has set standards, but also there are differences that distinguish Ethiopia as a very particular country. And I think it's appropriate to start by giving you a few informations about the origins, the history, because contrary to what President Sarkozy said once at the University of Antioch in Dakar, a very controversial speech when he said that the problem in Africa lied in the fact that the continent hadn't really entered into history, is precisely the contrary. History started in Africa. Our forebears, our ancestors, are to be found in Ethiopia. Lucy, whose remains are preserved in the Museum of History in Addis Ababa, and Arbi, 1 million years older, they are Ethiopians. We are all descendants of Ethiopian origins, so to say. There was always been a fascination in Europe towards Ethiopia, the country of Prester John, a country, Christian country surrounded by Muslim countries where Christianity was defended, and at the same time very old civilization. The first contacts between Europe and Ethiopia started in the Middle Ages, and then in the 15th and 16th century, especially because of the work of Jesuit missionaries. One of the most prominent of them was Pedro Páez, Spaniard, born in Olmeda de las Cebollas, very near Madrid. He wrote the first history of Ethiopia, a fascinating book that has been republished thanks to our support, Spanish support, with the Hakluyt Society in Portuguese and in English. In Amharic, that's a challenge that I leave to the Addis Ababa University to make an edition of the Pedro Páez History of Ethiopia in Amharic as well. So, and at that time, Pedro Páez, though he wrote in Portuguese and he was a member of the Portuguese branch of the Jesuit organization, he was a Spaniard, and at that time Portugal and Spain were united under a single monarchy, so it was Spain who was already present in Ethiopia, and it was a Spaniard, Pedro Paez, who discovered, the first European, not the first person, of course, to discover the sources of the Blue Nile in the north of Ethiopia, in the Tana Lake. There is one specific characteristic in Ethiopia, is that it's the only African country that was never colonized. The rest of the continent that was depicted, that was described in our European geographic maps as a void, a huge region, the heart of darkness, as was the famous title of a Joseph Conrad book that was translated into a cinema film, Apocalypse Now, by Francis Ford Coppola, based on that book. It was a mystery for us, for Europeans, for many centuries. Then, after the Berlin Conference in 1885, the continent was divided into different parcels that were attributed to the colonial powers, and so it came that today's political borders have nothing to do, with the exception of Ethiopia, maybe, with the human boundaries, with the populations that are ascribed to any specific country in Africa. That has had huge implications, very important implications for modern Africa. But they were very pragmatic when they acceded to independence in the 50s and the 60s of the last century. They respected those borders, not to open a Pandora box and start fighting for borders. They applied the principle uti possidetis iuris, and they said that was a lesser evil to maintain those frontiers. After the independence in the 50s and the 60s, it followed a time of optimism in Africa, with important leaders such as Sékou Touré in Guinea, Amílcar Cabral, Agostinho Neto, Nkrumah, the author of Africa Must Unite, and others who had this idea of trying to recover the roots of Africa. But at the end of the day, they put into practice political systems very similar to those that prevailed in Europe. After that time, it followed an era of conflict. Africa became the theater of the conflict between the two main superpowers during the Cold War, and many civil wars appeared all over the continent. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, that also had an impact in Ethiopia, where there was a communist dictatorship known as the Derg. The main powers and international community lost interest in Africa, so to say. The Washington consensus, liberal consensus, that obliged the African countries and others to open up to international trade, had very, very negative consequences on the process of industrialization and development in Africa. But as I said, the international community, the world, lost interest in Africa. Africa was left on its own devices. In the 90s, a lost decade in Africa, probably the most dramatic moment was lived in 94, when the genocide in Rwanda took place, and 1 million people were slaughtered in a few months. Well, after that, many transformations took place. In Ethiopia, a new regime took over from the Derg. The rebellion that started in the north, in the Tigray, led by the current Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, succeeded. they took power, and also little by little Africa started to recover. Now in the 21st century, and I come to modern times before the moderator gives me a word now to be briefer. I think that the continent is characterized by some features. First of all, there is an impressive economic growth that has surprised many people. The Economist, the British magazine, a decade ago, in 2001, dedicated a full report to Africa with the title "The Hopeless Continent." Only 10 years ago, very few people thought that Africa could recover and that this economic growth could take place. Nowadays, The Economist published another work on Africa on the rise of the continent and the potential that the continent is starting to display. And I think that because of this the new leadership in Africa, because of the new policies put in place, put in practice, there is a new hope for the continent. Just to give you a few data, in the last decade, 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies are to be found in Africa. One among them certainly is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is growing at a rate higher than 10% for the last 5 years. But also there is an increasing middle class in the continent. In the last few years, the middle class has doubled. Nowadays, you have almost 60 million people who are going to continue the transformation of the continent. There is an eagerness for new technologies. They are making a big leap in places where there are no telephone fixed lines. Africans can interconnect with mobile phones. There are 600 million mobile phone users in Africa. I mean, the same than in North America and Europe together. And also this being accompanied by rapid process of urbanization, which is another important feature. This economic growth has also led to a debate on the impact of development aid. For many years, Africa has received a lot of assistance from abroad, but without really much result. So some self-criticism about the impact, the efficiency of our support from the rest of the world has to be made. And that's one of the reasons why China and other emerging countries' model of cooperation with Africa is so successful, because they are coming to Africa with infrastructure, with soft loans, with what Africa is needing at this particular point in time. The times of this missionary humanitarianism as embodied by Bono, the U2 leader, are over, probably, and now the principles of the Paris and Accra agenda on international development that put a lot of emphasis on a ownership, on alignment, harmonization of our help are really being applied by the African governments and by international partners. The democratic principles are little by little taken root in Africa as well. I read once somewhere that for the first 30 years after independence, only one African leader, the president of Mauritius in a tiny island in Africa, had abandoned power peacefully after the result of elections. Well, the situation nowadays has dramatically changed. Elections are common rule in Africa, though sometimes they lead to some post-electoral conflict that give a lot of work to mediators, to people like Pastor Daniel, that I want to I want to say hello from here. I admire you very much on the work that you do as a prominent member of the elders group in Ethiopia, trying always to establish bridges and to solve conflicts, to mediate. So there is a lot of work, usually because a democracy in Africa is still a work in progress. It's a process that the most important thing is that the tendency goes in the right direction. And more and more elections are peaceful, with some setbacks. These days there has been another coup d'etat, unfortunately, in Mali, in a country that has made such an important progress in the last few years. But again, that shows the instability and the weakness of institutions in the continent. And I will finish now by telling you a few ideas on what I consider to be the main challenges that the continent has to face. First of all, how to sustain this economic growth that has been based mainly on the exploitation of natural resources in Africa. So how to diversify, how to sustain this process in the future. And one key element, in my opinion, would be the agricultural revolution. If we take Europe as an example, we have to bear in mind that the Industrial Revolution was a consequence of an agricultural revolution that took place before. In Ethiopia, and the leadership of the government of Meles Zenawi is something that is very clear, and they are putting a lot of emphasis and making efforts in order to really provide conditions for agriculture to take off in the country, with some controversial issues such as the lending of huge territories to foreign investors that has led to some criticism. But the important thing is that without a green revolution, economic growth in Africa won't be sustained. It's a scandal, in my opinion, that in Africa, where 2/3 of arable ground are to be found, almost half of the grain has to be imported, that 1/3 of the population depends on humanitarian food assistance from abroad. This is one important aspect. Another one is in order to consolidate those democratic gains, it is essential, in my opinion, to strengthen institutions, to work on the institutionalization, to turn the political parties into instruments to articulate public opinion, to channel the citizens' participation into the democratic system. That's a very, very important thing, because sometimes, on many occasions in Africa, political parties still today are instruments in the hands of tribal options. They don't respond to a political agenda, but more and more to personal interests. On this also there could be some debate, because you can't generalize, but this is an aspect to be taken into consideration. The demographic tendency is very important. By 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world will be an African. The African population will be doubled from a billion, 1,000 million, as we say in Spanish, to 2,000 million, to 2 billion people. That will be a huge difference. As the Chinese leader Mao said, every new birth is a new mouth to feed, but at the same time two more arms to work. So the difference will be if this new population, this youth, have the opportunity to work, to contribute to the economic system. That will be very important. On the contrary, if they become jobless, that could lead to social and economic instability, and even the seeds of a revolution, as the Arab Spring in the North of Africa and the Mediterranean could also take place south of the Sahara in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, those are a few aspects that I wanted to highlight to you. Challenges are there. I'm a believer, a true believer in Africa. I think that some African countries, such as Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, Kenya, of course, are now in the same situation as China or India a couple of 2 decades ago. They are really in a situation to take off, to become middle-income countries in the very near future, and I certainly believe that they have all the conditions and all the potential to become so. And from our part, we are bound to work together. We are linked by geography, we are linked by history, we are linked by culture, but we are also linked, which is much more important, by common interests. We have a stake in Africa. If Africa goes well, we'll be better off in Europe, and the contrary is also true. If we leave Africa and Africa fails, the whole world, but especially Europe, will suffer the consequences. So let's work together. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to my Ethiopian brothers and sisters.
Muchas gracias, embajador, por tu brillante intervención. Nos ha planteado todos los grandes desafíos del continente y los retos y los avances. Bueno, pues tenemos tiempo para preguntas, un debate, o sea que si alguien quiere romper el hielo. Profesora Bati.
One question. Well, just for the Kenyan representative, how is this? You were telling us about the road construction in Kenya, and it was in the newspaper in Ethiopia, like a couple of months ago, that there is a plan about for the road connecting Moyale and Isiolo, I think. It's very important in order to connect Ethiopia, I mean Addis Ababa and Nairobi. How is the situation about that?